Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this online panel session, part of the One Basin CRC series addressing key topics in the MDBA's Basin Plan Review discussion paper. Today's session is titled Managing the Basin Adaptively in the Face of a Changing Climate, and I am delighted to have you all with us. Go to the next slide. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge country. I am on unceded Kaurna land here in South Australia, and we acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the Murray-Darling Basin and their nations. We acknowledge their deep cultural, social, spiritual, environmental and economic connection to the lands and waters on which we live and work. And I pay my respect specifically to the elders of the Kaurna Nation and to the elders of all Basin nations, past, present and emerging. A little bit of background on the One Basin CRC for those who may be new to our work. The One Basin CRC is an industry and research collaboration established to tackle significant and complex water-related challenges in the Murray-Darling Basin. Our vision for Australia's irrigation regions is to be the most productive, resilient and sustainable in the world, and our purpose is to work together to grow value from water in a changing world. This panel is about managing for climate change in the Murray-Darling Basin. The Basin Plan has done real things. It dragged water back into a system that was being drained to exhaustion and that took enormous political effort and a decade of implementation. And we should acknowledge that. But it was built upon a particular assumption that we could characterise the basin's climate variability as a known probability distribution, roll the dice enough times to get the long-run statistics and set limits accordingly. That assumption is now structurally wrong. The climate is not just producing different outcomes from the same distribution, the distribution itself is changing, and that is a fundamentally different kind of problem. The question I want this panel to sit with is not whether the science is telling us something serious, it is. The question is whether we have the governance architecture, the institutional design, and the decision-making frameworks to actually respond to what the science is telling us. And potentially the honest answer might be not yet. But this panel is not here to catalogue what's wrong. We're here to be constructive, specific and practical because the MDBA is making decisions right now. The Water Act review is running concurrently, and there's a real window to shape both. I have three people with me today who think about this from genuinely different vantage points. A researcher who can tell us what a different approach to risk and uncertainty actually demands from planning frameworks, a governance and cybernetics scholar who can tell us what institutional architecture needs to look like if we want it to learn and adapt under complexity, and a practitioner at the end of the system who can tell us in plain terms what all of this means when you are the person who has to make a decision about where Adelaide's water comes from in 30 years' time. I'll just introduce each of our panellists. Seth Westra is a Professor of Hydrology and Climate Risk at Adelaide University. He's the Research Director of the One Basin CRC and the lead author of the upcoming 7th Assessment Report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He will speak today to what a genuinely risk-informed approach to basin planning requires and why the current framework may be structured around the wrong kind of problem. Catherine Daniel is Director of the ANU School of Cybernetics and holds affiliations as Professor in the Fenner School of Environment and Society and the Institute for Water Futures. Catherine works on collaborative governance, multi-level coordination, and the design of institutions capable of learning and adapting under complexity. She'll speak to what the basin's governance architecture needs to do differently when risks are coupled across water, land, energy, health, and regional development, and the planning frameworks are not. Ashley Kingsborough is from SA Water. He sits at the end of the Murray system, making long horizon infrastructure decisions for a city of 1.4 million people against projections with wide uncertainty bands and regulatory frameworks that have not fully caught up to the climate science. He will translate this conversation into what it means when you are the decision maker who has to commit right now to where Adelaide's water comes from in 30 years' time. I will begin with questions to Seth. Hi, Seth.
Hello.
My first question for you is, there's a distinction between the kind of climate variability we have always managed, floods and droughts as outcomes of a known probability distribution, and something fundamentally different that climate change creates. Can you explain that distinction and why it matters so much for how we design planning frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ariella. So, I mean, firstly, to highlight, there is a little bit of nuance involved in terms of how we've managed historical climate variability. Yes, it's in some sense run as a probability distribution, but of course, anyone who's involved in sort of governing water will know that there's a lot more that feeds into it than that. So this is a little bit of a sort of abstraction or simplification. But I think it is true to say that we have kind of treated sort of climate outcomes analogous to the rolling of a dice, which is what you sort of said in your intro, Ariella. And I think this is really driven by the fact, and this might be sort of an unusual way of representing it, but we've actually benefited from quite a lot of certainty in a way in our basin planning. We've had historical records that date back to the 19th century or well before. If you sort of look at the instrumental record, the paleo record that goes even further back, Indigenous knowledges as well, all part of that. We've benefited from a lot of knowledge around that historical variability. And that variability has been used in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of decisions across the basin and beyond, whether it is to do with basin planning or infrastructure design or a whole range of other sort of related decisions, including in the context of the last basin plan. So I think a key distinction I think we need to make is that we're moving from an environment of relative certainty about the distribution of historical floods and droughts to one of a different type of uncertainty. And I guess a sort of risk of overdeveloping that rolling of the dice example, we're moving from a situation where, okay, we don't know if next year is going to be a wetter than average year or a drier than average year, but we're fairly confident about the probabilities, to a situation where we don't even know what the probability of rolling a 1 or a 6 is, or even, if there's only 6 sides to the die, maybe there's a hidden 7th side that we haven't seen before. And so it's kind of characteristically a different type of problem in terms of how we manage our uncertainty compared to the one that we've been used to. So let's put that into a little bit of context and speak from the vantage point of today, 2026, where we know that climate is changing. So for all intents and purposes, I think it will be fair to say that we've reached the point of 1.5 degrees of warming since pre-industrial times. I mean, the last 3 years of global temperatures have been, within a whisker of that 1.5 degrees, and it's staying very, very warm. So we know that the past does not reflect today, let alone the future. And based on the modelling that CSIRO did for the MDBA as part of this basin plan work, we know that these changes are going to have quite material outcomes for the basin, as articulated in terms of the sorts of outcomes that the Water Act and the Basin Plan have envisaged across economic, social, environmental contexts. So this creates quite a few different issues for us. But the one point that I really want to emphasise is that this really does need to change the game in terms of how we manage risk. And this doesn't just relate to the technical problem of how we analyse and come to understand risk, but also there's a range of broader, I guess, cultural and governance dimensions in terms of how we make judgments about risks and how we actually build a system that can respond to those risks. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's sort of easy to think about climate change as just another uncertainty, but I think the sort of uncertainty that this brings about is categorically different to what we've sort of managed in the past.
That's really important and very profound. I'm keen to make this more concrete. My understanding is that the current sustainable diversion limit framework was built on long-run historical averages that I think you were saying are no longer a reliable guide to the future. Is that a problem?
That's a good question, and the answer is I think yes and no. So to my understanding of how this all works, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with using the sustainable diversion limit architecture based on historical data and historical baselines. It's part of an accounting system to manage our water. So in such an accounting system, which is basically about administering the rules under the basin plan, I think one baseline is more or less as good as any other baseline if you know that the assumptions that you're working with and what the implication of those assumptions are. And I think there's good reason not to necessarily change the accounting system too often. So I think there are good reasons to stay with sort of using these sort of historical long run averages for aspects of the basin plan work. But there's areas that can become unstuck, and I just want to sort of delve into one example of where it could become a bit of a problem. And this is quite relevant to the basin plan, and it relates to the framework for making that test of whether the sustainable diversion limits represent an environmentally sustainable level of take. So this is one of the primary questions that this basin plan review needs to ask. It's part of the Water Act. It's something that needs to be asked by law. And I would argue that the precise form of the question that we need to ask is whether the sustainable diversion limits represent an environmentally sustainable level of take now and over this period up until the next review, recognising that, as I said before, I think we're now in a world of 1.5 degree warming relative to pre-industrial times. And it may well be over the next decade that we significantly exceed that. We might be 1.7, 1.8 degrees above pre-industrial over the next decade based on sort of current and warming rates. So I'm going to get a little bit technical into the basin plan review mechanisms because I think it's worth unpacking this a little bit. But the broad message I want to sort of make is that I think we still have ingrained in us a retrospective approach to risk management, an approach that really focuses on looking at historical data, historical variability, that works well when we can use that data as a direct analogue for what will happen in the future, but becomes a little bit more problematic when we know that the future will be actually quite different from the past, and the present is already a long way towards that future. So let me unpack that with a bit of a concrete example that's very, very specifically related to this current iteration of the Basin Plan Review. So the assessment, if anyone sort of looked at the discussion paper or the documents like the sustainable yields documents that underlie that, is based on essentially three different lines of inquiry. The first one is about sort of current implementation status of the Basin Plan, so with the water buybacks and so on that have occurred up until now. The second line of inquiry is the full implementation of the Basin Plan. And the third line of inquiry is the full implementation of the Basin Plan under a range of plausible future climate scenarios. And the use of the word future, I think, is quite interesting in that context. There's no real reference to the word current in either of those three different lines of inquiry. And in fact, the first of those two lines of inquiry are based on what is referred to as an extended historical climate condition, which is essentially the record from 1895 to 2024. Now, the midpoint of that record is 1960, which, of course, was a completely different time. Yes, that record contains a little bit of information over the climate over the last 2 decades or so, but in terms of characterising risk, that data set sits closer to a pre-climate change world than it does to a world of 1.5 degree warming. And my understanding of, I guess, the assessments that have been made suggests that the historical record, those lines of inquiry 1 and 2, represent the primary line of inquiry. And this is the line of inquiry that's been included in the Basin Plan discussion paper in terms of the basis for these determinations. Climate change is considered, scenarios are considered, but they're not used to anchor. It's the historical record that represents the anchor in terms of the risk assessments, and then the climate change assessment is sort of broadly part of that consideration. Now, I think that's a bit of a problem. We might quibble about exactly when we reach that 1.5 degree threshold, but I think it's fairly unambiguous to say that the world in 2030, those 2030 scenarios that CSIRO have developed as part of this, are a much more, I guess, realistic reflection of the conditions presently than a historical record which is centred in 1960. And I'd argue, this historical record really is just a window into what happened in the 20th century rather than something that's reflective of risk today. So I guess just to wrap this up, I think this is an example of a pattern that I have seen quite a lot in water management in lots of different contexts over the last few years, not just in relation to the Murray-Darling Basin. And so one recommendation I'd really like, I think we need to make explicit, is this need to anchor any risk assessment in what we understand the climate of today and the near term to be, and not always sort of run towards that historical record as kind of the best data set available to sort of manage present and future climate risks. Thanks, Ariel.
As a futures and foresight person, I'm obviously very excited to hear that answer that you just gave. So what I'm hearing is that one part of adaptive planning is really being able to let go of long-held assumptions about how we manage risks and update the risk settings in a more dynamic manner that is a better fit for the conditions that we're in now and that we're facing. What else might be useful in order to strengthen the adaptive capacity of how we manage the basin?
I mean, I'm sure there's many answers to that question, Ariella, and I suspect the other speakers will have other views as well. I'll just pick three very quickly. The first is that I think the basin plan architecture could benefit from stronger guidance in terms of how we assess present risk. That sort of more evenly balances this retrospective and prospective, futures element. It can't just be a review mirror approach to risk, and really needs to work out how we look more effectively in both directions. So I think that's kind of point one. Point two is I think because the risk is changing, the answer to questions like do the sustainable diversion limits represent an environmentally sustainable level of take is going to change every single time we make this review. And I think the basin plan sort of review would benefit from a little bit more structure and guidance in terms of how we do this. Because I guess every time we make this assessment, it's quite unsettling for a lot of different people. And how do we also acknowledge the fact that the outcomes that we're trying to seek across the basin are also going to be quite dynamic? What does an environmentally sustainable basin look like under these changed climates? That will be an evolving discussion, I'm sure. And I guess the third thing is really about how we learn. And so, some people suggest, an adaptive pathways approach. So we do things once certain things are triggered. But because of the uncertainty, it's very hard to actually do that because, like, let's say we get into a drought next year and then there's another drought the year after that. Is that because something has structurally changed, or were we just unlucky and we just happened to have back-to-back droughts, which of course has happened in the past? And so it's very hard to work out what are these triggers that would suggest that we need to make some changes. So we need to think a bit more about how do we really embed adaptive planning, recognising that there is so much uncertainty and that if you wait for the data to be in, for the science to be in, it'll often be too late because, again, that's the retrospective approach. So I think those are three dimensions. Each of them have a lot of subtlety and nuance that I don't really have time to sort of, elaborate on in my answer now. But I think those are three things that would be really helpful to look at further in this basin planning process.
Thank you so much, Seth. I'm going to turn to Catherine now to respond. Seth has described a shift from a world where we could use statistics to manage known variability to a world where the underlying system is changing in ways we cannot fully characterise. From a governance and cybernetics perspective, what does that shift demand from our institutions, and what has to change about how decisions are made, not just which decisions are made?
Thanks, Ariella. There's a lot in there, and I might just help unpack a little bit of it. First of all, hello, everyone. For those of you who haven't had a background in cybernetics, it's a big word. It really talks about how we govern. It's quite close to governance as a concept, and it thinks about how we can pilot and navigate complexity effectively. So looking at things like communication and feedback. In terms of, how might we shift institutions? I think one of the big challenges we've got in the basin and actually all of our governing systems globally and in Australia are that we really need to recognise the interdependency of many of our systems and often the lack of independent control that we have over almost any area that might be of interest. Now, in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, we draw on international environmental legislation to do many of these things, and we look particularly at water. But all of the other challenges that we're talking about, Seth was talking about, climate changes, how we might be using energy, or the socioeconomic and cultural outcomes that we're looking for in the basin and in communities, they really require the development of more cross-jurisdictional or multi-level and multi-scalar cooperation regimes. Now, they're really big words, but it really means, how do we figure out who we need to work with to do things collectively in a way where one silo won't negatively impact another silo? And I think That's also thinking about really deeply, how particular forms of feedback, so if something happens and something else happens, it can often spiral out of control. If feedback's entrenched in one particular direction, like we see with, say, climate change and temperature rise, we need to figure out, the other actions that will actually be required to manage the externalities of that particular choice. And I think in some ways in the basin, it means we've got to get a lot more comfortable with shared control, mutual accountability, and then adjusting processes when the desired new governing mechanisms push the system behaviour too far in undesirable directions. Seth was talking about, triggers. I think one of the challenges we need to think about is, do we have kind of viable system spaces that we've mapped out for the basin? And if we end up going beyond those viable spaces, if we can detect, if we have the intelligence and the means of data collection to tell that, then what extra actions might we need to put in place? And that might be actions with other groups. So it might be that we actually need to work with another government department, with local councils, with state government, with water corporations, with communities, etc. And so I think that also means we've got to get more comfortable with taking into account those different multiple streams of intelligence, data and knowledge. And also, Ariella, you've done some work globally looking at trends. This is also in a partial and kind of strategically opaque area, and often when trust is low, and that we're trying to interpret those kind of signals despite uncertainties. And I think this is just as important when we're thinking about all sorts of knowledges, whether they're, First Nations people's knowledges and how they maybe get used or abused in certain processes. It's also about worried government officials who might kind of let their information out, and people will, find ways of using that. So I think we need more actions to actually build trust if we want to keep this kind of work going. And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's a really important part of the basin review process.
All of that resonates so deeply, Catherine, and I wish we could just have an entire session on all of those things. And one of the trends that I'm tracking globally is actually just there's a trend towards people not wanting to share data and information, from agreed transparency to more like a type of strategic opacity. One of the things that came through strongly in preparation for this panel is how opaque the modelling and rule routing is, even to people who are really deeply inside the system. There's a real question about whether you can track how changes in rainfall translate through the models and the legislation to actual outcomes on the ground. Is that opacity itself a governance failure? And if so, what would you say is the fix?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's a failure or it's actually part of how the system functions. So in some ways, I would suggest it goes to my earlier points on interdependencies and trust. When trust is low, there will be more opacity. When trust is high, people will let that information out because they believe in collective work. So I think there is work to do there if we want a high trust basin. There are things that each actor can do to support that. I think the other challenge is that there are a bunch of different interdependencies between the known modelling methods, the kinds of education and training and perceived competency that people have in these particular methods. For example, we teach certain forms of modelling in our universities. We train people in our bureaucracies to do certain things. There's also been quite a lot of very large investments in the modelling systems that are used by the MDBA, by the state governments, by different universities and others. And so I think there are challenges there with those infrastructures in not necessarily wanting to engage in the potential risks of trialling other more innovative methods that, for example, might overcome some of the assumptions that are baked in that Seth was talking about. And so any form of that kind of innovation will also need to, you'll need to upskill people or potentially even change staff, and those kinds of risks, or even outsource, the modelling processes if there are particular systems. And so that is a collection of risks that I don't know whether it's necessarily a governance failure, but there have been choices that have been made that kind of put much of the system into a locked-in system, and so we can only kind of incrementally move forward. Now that's also protective because it protects many external people from uncertainty, but it doesn't necessarily help with the kinds of uncertainties that Seth is talking about when we really do tip over potentially, and if our entire system is not able to understand, model that change. So I think there's actually opportunities to fix some of these areas where we see there are real assumption problems now. I think we can start testing things on the side. It might be with, simpler models or systems models that are managed by other people that bring other factors in and some of the other interdependent areas that, say, the Murray-Darling Basin doesn't usually focus on because of its legislation. And then we can fund experiments and kind of look at how we might couple or replace certain parts where there are viable change strategies that could potentially lead to that improved overall performance. So I'm not sure whether it's entire failure, but it's certainly the system is doing what the system does. And I think there are ways that we can slowly move it towards some improved states.
Yeah. The basin involves the Commonwealth, 5 states, dozens of agencies, catchment bodies, and the MDBA all operating with partially incompatible frameworks. There are also major national processes like the National Climate Risk Assessment that are mostly disconnected from basin planning. What would a genuinely integrated governance architecture look like, and is it achievable within the current legislative framework?
Again, I think this is an interesting one in that all of these systems are set up under a Westminster system with, a federal system. There will always be challenges in a system like that, but there's also a lot of opportunities. I think if you look at the National Climate Risk Assessment, there's so much that's relevant to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan review. It is worth us thinking about it. In terms of, that question you asked earlier about cybernetics and governance, the NCRA in their process talks about good governance, referring to the characteristics that enable the most effective action to be taken. Now, for effective action to be taken, we need to get really used to the idea of continuous negotiation. Because things change all the time, we will have to continuously negotiate. And in some ways, the Basin Plan being reviewed every 10 years is a continuous negotiation. It's just on a much longer time frame. And so I think part of the next round of reforms will have to continue to negotiate the sharing of benefits and the mitigating of the worst harms. If we think about the opportunities in this round of review, I think culturally many Australians aspire to some form of egalitarianism, but that this does come into conflict with resource distribution when we think about water in particular, and then the persistent inequalities and abilities to join in negotiating of governance adjustments. There's some really good steps that have been taken over the past few years, particularly in terms of recognition of First Nations and the inequalities that have been present from aqua nullius through to how to support and be a part of not only environmental watering but also having water for cultural and economic development. So I think there are all sorts of challenges there where we need to kind of support and recognise the challenges and trade-offs across a range of perspectives. Part of this continuous negotiation still requires this upskilling. It means that many of the people, us included, who are involved in negotiating these things need to craft and get better at listening, learning, leaning in to try and innovate or use, already successful methods of engaging with positive intention for those collective outcomes. I think one of the challenges you talked earlier about learning is that we need to work more towards learning and reflection, less siloing and patch protection, but we won't be able to do that if there's still a fear of retribution and blowback. So we really do need to work on developing those safe spaces, places where we can convene, where we can really listen, and then kind of work forward through all of the different benefits and potential harms to try to figure out a better way forward. But yeah, I think a genuinely integrated governance architecture, there is no real way of managing that except through continually kind of moving towards small adjustments, and we can talk about some small adjustments maybe later.
I loved all of that, and you've given something us all something to do immediately with regards to increasing the surface area of conversations across all of the divides. We're good at responding to disasters. We spend everything and mobilise fast, but that's reactive. What would a more risk-aware, proactive process look like? One that feels like active governance rather than a perpetual crisis response?
Yeah, I love that question. I think in some ways it goes to also the climate risk assessment process. I think we could actually get a lot better at doing a lot of sort of situational and scenario disaster kind of response training. We can make this stuff fun. We can do it collectively. And we can try to kind of build potential actions for resilience. We're really good at doing this in Australia. We do it in schools for lockdowns. We do it for fire emergency training. Most of our buildings have had training. I think we actually need to get much better at kind of serious gaming, understanding disasters, and understanding how like things change from a disaster to, you know, our normal kind of governance. Sometimes I call it from plod governance to kind of crisis management. Often actually in Australia, we're much better at crisis management than our plod governance. But we need to think about how we help both agencies and individuals understand the differences between those. Often we really like crisis management because we can drop everything else. We can prioritize to kind of keep people safe, do things that are going to help, but then we leave all of the other kind of longer term systematic and systemic work. So we need to kind of get better at understanding why those two things are different, when they might appear, and how we switch better from one system to the other so that we can actually develop a bunch of supports proactively so that when we move from one to another, we're doing that much more effectively. I think the other thing is that, you know, people talk about the old hydrological cycle. We don't think about, you know, flood management until we've been flooded, or drought management until we're in drought. And so we do have to still be aware of different windows of opportunity and the leadership that various different groups across the whole governing arena can take to help enable these phases of strategic envisioning and preparedness training, because it doesn't work well when you're in the middle of the crisis. Like, you kind of have to do it before. So I think there's a real opportunity potentially for the One Basin CRC and all of our partners to help a lot with that particular bit of work.
Yeah, it's like rehearsing different futures. And I can't help feeling like one of the differences I notice between disaster versus plod governance is that people are able to speak to each other and have different conversations and collaborate in ways that they don't do under the plod conditions. Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm going to move on to Ashley. Hi, Ashley. SA Water sits at the end of the Murray system. Can you describe in plain terms what a significant reduction in basin-wide surface water availability actually means for how you run a water utility and what you can promise to the people who depend on you?
Thanks, Ariella. Thanks everyone for having me today. Sounds like a simple question, and probably the answer is no, which is part of the challenge I think that we're starting to address here. So I think there are genuine challenges in our understanding of, you know, if we're to see a reduction in water availability across the basin, that's rainfall happening in Victoria and New South Wales and Queensland. What does that actually mean in terms of water availability changes here in South Australia? And because of some of that opacity that Catherine talked about before, it's not clear what changes in that raindrop mean in terms of water coming across the border in South Australia, and then water that we can supply to our customers. So I guess given that degree of uncertainty, we do know that there are going to be significant impacts of climate change. And I guess ultimately it means that we have a reduced confidence in water availability coming down the River Murray, which is a challenge in itself. Now, part of that leads to then, yes, we're actively seeking to reduce our reliability on, our reliance on the River Murray here in South Australia. That's a function of that. But how we do that in practical terms is somewhat still under question, and the devil really is in the detail here. So it's not about is the basin climate changing or not, but it's really about, you know, how fast and when, and really being able to unpack some of those variables are really important for our investment decision making as we see the basin going forward. And we're just like any other entitlement holder in the basin in many regards, in the understanding the reliability of our entitlements now and into the future, and how that changes in a changing climate become key inputs into our decision making here from a business perspective. On the flip side of that, though, I would, I guess, like to say that there have been significant investments in improved water security for Adelaide, at least since the last major drought, in the Millennium Drought. So we've seen investment in a desalination plant. We've seen changes to policy settings that made the critical human water needs have greater protections than they had previously. So yes, there have been responses, and these have been the types of responses, but we're going to continue to need to keep responding into the future. And the critical question there, I think Seth touched on it almost at the start, is what is the climate of now, and how are we incorporating the climate of now in our decision making? Because in the absence of improved decision information, we'll continue to look at historical climates to inform our understanding of the climate of now.
I feel like you've already in some ways gone some way to addressing the question that I wanted to ask you next, which was about, for what level of climate impact can you still rely on the Basin Plan and the Water Act settings to give Adelaide the water security it needs, and at what point does that tip into investing billions into alternative sources? And what I was hearing is we're already investing in those alternative sources, but I was wondering if you could add any further comments on the degree to which you're still relying on the Basin Plan and the Water Act settings.
Yeah, so the Basin Plan and the Water Act and the general strong governance we have in Australia is a really important part, and the water market that comes with that, with both those reforms, really are key pieces around how we seek to run our portfolio of water resources here. So that strong governance gives us confidence in that as a water resource. And on the flip side, yes, we see reducing reliability into the future as a function of changing climate. And so those two things are in contrast with each other, and they're pulling against each other at different times. What do we need to do? Well, we have strong confidence that we could maintain Adelaide's water security in a repeat of the Millennium Drought. So that's a really good outcome from my perspective. But is the Millennium Drought a reasonable drought to be planning for is probably more of an open question. And so that's probably touched on this already, but if we start pushing into droughts where we see reduced or less than 100% irrigation allocations here in South Australia beyond 4, 5, 6 years, then we start to get really challenged in terms of being able to maintain water security, and we're relying on us then being able to implement more temporary mechanisms in that regard. And Seth's also mentioned around this idea of adaptation pathways and having triggers. And really the key thing we see, I guess, with regard to triggers is they are difficult to identify, but really it's the lead time that are a really key piece of the puzzle here. So if we're looking at a major new piece of infrastructure, and this is not dissimilar for other utilities or other water users across the basin, they will have multi-year lead times to run into. So you need to be making a decision. If we need a new desalination plant in Adelaide, it's really got a decade of runtime almost once you start the kind of ideation through to water flowing. And so these are long lead times in a rapidly changing system, and that creates its own complexity as well there. The other piece, yeah, probably did just want to touch on, Ariella, is that it's also the demand side. So we're talking a lot about supply, but as the climate changes, we see different demand profiles as well into the future. And so from a utility perspective, we see increasing water use. We're also going through quite a period of economic growth here in South Australia, which is great on one hand, but we see more people moving to South Australia, so more people becoming dependent on these same set of water resources, which drives the case for investment, but it also increases that challenge.
Yeah, and new industries, all sorts of changes going on the demand side all over the place. I have to say, as someone who lives in South Australia, I'm incredibly grateful to you and everyone at SA Water that you can sit there and say we're confident that we can guarantee the water security of Adelaide under this range of conditions is a massive achievement. So on both the supply and the demand sides, and thinking about the information that you need to make the decisions that you make in your day-to-day job, like what I'm hearing is that the basin-wide models and the rule flows and the things that you do have access to in terms of what's reaching South Australia and then onto entitlement, reliability, demand side, everything, it's apparently still not available in a form that's easy for you to act on. Can you say a little bit more about what specifically is missing, what you wish you had, and what you think it would take to produce it?
Yeah, look, and I really want to acknowledge that there has been such a huge body of work in this space from the MDBA and from many research organisations across the last decade and more. And so much, we have seen significant improvements. But I do still think there is a challenge in being able to translate what we understand, as you've said, in terms of potential climate impacts into the decision relevant variables. And so for many water users, ourselves included, entitlement reliability is a really, really important variable. You know, when you might want to go to the bank to be able to refinance or borrow against, understanding the reliability of entitlements is really important for those in the irrigation sector. And we kind of have a similar analogue here within the utility. It's also around drought sequences, and so that becomes particularly important. So in a changing climate, is the length of the drought going to increase, or is the severity of the drought going to increase? And it's really those combination of how we're stretching and pulling droughts into the future that becomes really, really important. Because ultimately we need to be able to make investment cases to our owner to say, okay, we're going to need to invest in an alternate source. And, you know, public finances are extremely stretched across the country at the moment. And so investing in something that may occur is a really challenging proposition for a utility. So really having, I guess, the strongest evidence base we can have to invest in those alternatives becomes really, really important part of the puzzle here.
That makes a lot of sense. I have one final question. Actually, if the MDBA is in the room, which I believe they are, what is the one thing that you want them to walk away understanding that might not have landed yet? It's an opportunity to take.
Oh, look, I mean, I think these are familiar issues and topics for the MDBA, and these are conversations that are being had in many places, which we really appreciate. But I think it's really, really important for the MDBA to be able to remember the really essential role it plays with the overview of the entire system. So I think, you know, it's very uniquely placed there to be able to see the Northern Basin, the Southern Basin, and how that flows down into South Australia, and that whole of system view and that corralling of the states and the jurisdictions is really important and will continue to be really, really important. And I'm going to borrow one of the terms from one of my MDBA colleagues that he recently mentioned, because it really resonated with me, and I was thinking along a similar line. But how are we investing in the science of the future? So we've kind of had a science of the past. You know, it has served us well and set that conversation up really, really well. But I don't get the sense that it's the science that we're going to need to inform the future. And really, things are iterating really quickly. The basin is changing, and the whole of our climate is changing. And that those loops, as Catherine has mentioned, they're getting tighter as we move through time. So how do we have the science that can iterate quickly enough to inform those next investment decisions? I think that's probably, you know, not just the MDBA's challenge. I think it's our shared challenge as water users, researchers, and kind of people involved in the governance of the basin overall. And I really, if anything, it's probably the key bit that I always come back to, both from my experience in kind of decision science, but also, you know, as a water user now, is being able to translate the climate information into decision relevant variables to help people make decisions that can inform their own businesses or the management of important environmental assets or whatever that decision is. People are generally pretty good in terms of understanding what are the threshold issues that are important to them. I think it's incumbent then on the kind of the science and the governance community to be able to translate this complexity of, it is very, very complex. How's the change of climate? How are all the rules and the settings? What is the hydrology doing? How are the changed catchment behaviours affecting all of this? It's too much in many regards for people who don't have backgrounds in that, but they know what is important to them I think it's incumbent on this community to be able to translate that complexity into decision relevant variables.
That's really well said. And I love that you talked about the science of the future. And I feel like that might be our jobs, everyone on this panel. I would like to give the people on the panel an unexpected brief chance to respond to each other, just in case while listening to that, there's something that came up for you before I ask one last question to all three of you and then open up to what's in the Q&A with whatever time is left. But did any of you, now that you've all heard each other speak, is there anything that that you wanted to add in response?
Just here to the science of the future. I mean, I think this is a really important one because it goes very deeply to Seth's points around, you know, looking backwards, and we're actually here at the moment. So what's the science of now, and then what's the science of the future, and how are all of those knowledges going to be helping us? So I think it's a very, very handy phrase. And I think actually behind it, there is a lot of really good science and knowledge about how to do futures well. You know this deeply, Ariella. And so I do think that is a very relevant thing. And also that translation part that Ashley's talking about. It's one of the hardest things to do. And I think being able to cut through some of the complexity and or chaos to get to things that are important to people, I think that it's really, really important. And if we can get to that, we will all be doing the best we can in our jobs.
Thanks, Catherine. And as someone who spends a lot of time doing very systematic and rigorous forms of future and foresight work, you know, I can also acknowledge that traditional definitions of science, you know, that we don't have data about the future. We have data about the past up until the present, which is part of the reason why we're in this situation. What we have about the future is assumptions. So even our understandings of what constitutes rigor and quality control and good quality science, the science of the future starts entering into territories around post-normal science and a lot of really interesting things. May we have a webinar about all of that. Seth, did you have any response before my final question?
Sure. Well, I might actually even just respond to that last sort of commentary, Ariella, because I really agree with it. And I think, you know, as I sort of said in my earlier sort of comments, I think this is partly about just the work of risk analysis and understanding where we are now, but it's also the cultural dimensions and the value systems. And I think this idea of really needing a strong empirical basis for decisions sounds really good in principle, but because you don't have data for the future, as you so sort of nicely said, Ariella, it does create this kind of bias about the past. I mean, there's other elements of science. You know, one example that I often use is p-values, that you sort of need to be 95, you know, loosely speaking, 95% sure of an alternative hypothesis before you overturn the null hypothesis. That can be really problematic in risk assessment, where you need to kind of basically have overwhelming evidence that something is kind of possible before you actually accept it as a genuine possibility. And so there are sort of elements of kind of normal science that I think are actually really important in certain contexts. But if you're trying to have a more dynamic risk type approach, can also get you in trouble. There's a strong level of conservatism, if you like, built in. And I think that's those sort of cultural elements about what science is, how do we commission science, what does good evidence look like, all those sorts of questions that also get brought, you know, come into this whole, you know, challenge of how do we sort of balance prospective and retrospective kind of understanding of risk.
Absolutely. Ashley, I think you're off mute. Is that because you've also got a response? No? Okay. I have to stop myself from wanting to say so many things about that. This might be my favourite new topic. Okay, I have a question for all three of you to respond in any order that you feel moved. Given the political environment, the long feedback loops, the institutional inertia, and the gap between what the science says and what the institutions are willing to act on, what is realistic? What can the MDBA actually do within its mandate and in this review cycle, given everything that it's subject to, that would constitute genuine progress? Catherine.
I'm happy to go if you want. All right. I think one of the opportunities is to take the analysis that's been done, and I know the MDBA, particularly looking at the SDLs and which ones might, which levels of take are potentially need to be revisited. I think there's potential in, say, those basin areas to develop small compacts on those kind of highest climate risks, and to provide some national leadership with, say, DQ and state governments, plus key delivery partners, whether that's private companies, universities, First Nations, public, for those particular areas. I'll give just one example. The Barwon, Darling and Barker area has come up as one where there's real challenges of whether the SDL actually represents an environmentally sustainable level of take, and particularly around, say, critical drinking water. And so there could be, specific little compact around participatory processes there needed to look at infrastructure, critical needs, cultural needs, and all of the work that's there, to figure out, well, how do those SDLs need to work, and if they can't work, and the future ones need to be created, how do you actually renegotiate and invest in those areas where the outcomes are at most significant risk? So not do everything, but just concentrate on the ones where those climate risks are highest, and run that additional kind of participatory process to support that work.
Well said. Seth?
Yeah, I was just seconding that. I think just in terms of really simple sort of concrete recommendation that I would make is to treat the 2030 climate scenarios, which CSR have produced as part of sustainable yields and which are available, now as essentially the representation of current climate risk, not as a future climate risk assessment, but representative of the risk, in 2026. Given that we're already in that sort of 1.5 degree world, and really start treating the historical record as exactly that, historical, bit of information that's useful, but that's not representative of current risk. So I think that's complete. All the data is available, all the analysis is there. The MDB have already sort of been looking at that data quite rigorously. I think it's just changing the anchor point in terms of where we are now, and looking at what does a different anchor actually look like in terms of the sorts of SDL type decisions and other decisions that come from that. I think the other thing that I'd sort of recommend sort of looking at is more language, I think, around risk rather than outcomes. So outcomes are, things like, water security for towns, agricultural water, et cetera, but we're making decisions under risk. We're making decisions under uncertainty. And we'd have different levels of tolerance to, even look in environmental space, for example, to a temporary degradation of an ecosystem compared to irreversible loss of a species or something like that. There'd be totally different risk appetite. Farmers are very good at dealing with risk, in terms of their water, but to a point, there's a point where the risk will just no longer make for a viable business. And so everyone has different risk thresholds and so on. And I think we haven't really worked out how to embed that thinking into the Basin plan. There's too much focus on outcome rather than the possibility that we might not actually be able to achieve all the outcomes.
I like to think about minimising maximum regrets across that range of really plausible scenarios. I heard what Ashley said about how it's difficult to motivate government spending in constrained times with respect to something that might happen. And yet, given that we are making decisions under uncertainty, being able to minimise those maximum regrets for things that we could reasonably foresee seems like a reasonable thing. Ashley, do you want to have a last word on that?
Yeah, I think that idea of minimising maximum regrets is really important, particularly when it comes to water security and drought management. So yeah, very much on board with that. I think for the MDBA, I think it's just maintaining their commitment to understanding the impacts of climate at a system scale, and then being able to share that in a manner in which we can translate into decision relevant variables. And I think just understanding that many water users have a shared interest in these outcomes, and we're willing to kind of keep pushing and driving them, because these are shared risks that we all are managing. We're going to be affected by them differently, and Seth has said we've got different risk tolerances for different types of risks. But the more we can share and the more transparent we can make that information on our understanding of those risks, then I think we can all make our own collective, individual and collective good decisions. Because I think if individually we're making a lot of good decisions, then hopefully for the collective, there's kind of a self-reinforcing piece there as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely great. Now, I had hoped that we would have time for the questions in the Q&A session, but I'll have to just collect those and, along with our responses, and find a way to get back to you, because I've reached my time limit and I'm up to the closing. So that brings us to the end of today's session. And on behalf of the One Basin CRC, I'd like to sincerely thank our panelists for really openly and authentically sharing their expertise and insights. And of course, thank all of you online for joining us and for your questions that you have shared. And if you'd like to find out more about our full series of online panel sessions covering topics relevant to the Basin Plan Review, I encourage you to visit the One Basin Review Hub on our website. The address and QR code are on the screen, so you can get them. The Review Hub has information about all upcoming sessions and also the recordings of all the sessions, including today's one, that are going to be made available in the coming weeks. So do save the link and revisit anytime that you'd like to review. And finally, I want to let you know about our next session, which will be held tomorrow, that is scaling water banking in aquifers, and that is chaired by Professor Seth Westra, who has been a member of this panel today, and we hope to see you there. And thank you again, everyone, and wishing you a really wonderful day.